Hello. What I've decided to do, and I've spent a bit of time on this, so I'm really hoping that it'll be useful to you, is to create an assessment breakdown for the first assessment and to give some ideas. So I've thought about if I was writing this, what would I include in each section? And I've created a bit of a plan, which you absolutely do not need to stick with, but I thought it might be quite helpful as I'm really keen, because we're doing this as an online sort of experience, to make sure that you get as much support as possible, and so almost to go over and above what I'd normally do to try and give you that support. So this is for the first assessment, and here is the way that I'd approach it. And I'm going to talk you through it and explain really which theories and models that I think you could use as well. So with the case study, obviously you need to choose an organisation from the FTSE Tech Mark 100, so not just the FTSE 100, which is what Tom spoke about in his session. It's the Tech Mark 100. So I'm still keen to hear from those of you that haven't said which organisation you're doing yet, which one you're doing. That would be really useful. So I'd start it with the organisation itself. The first section, I'd use about 700 words for it. So we've got between 1800 and 2200 words. And the first section will cover the first learning outcome. So this is learning outcome 1, exploring the financial context for contemporary organisations, including the source of appropriate finance. So I'm just I've come up with a bit of a brainstorm really as to how I'd group it together. So again, absolutely feel free to change this around, but these are some things that you could include in it. So to start off by introducing the organisation and giving a bit of context to the sector. So I'd look at their annual reports about this, but I'd really try and make this quite interesting and attention grabbing. So what is going on in their particular area or their industry at the moment? So you could use the information that they supply, but we could look a bit broader in terms of some of the databases that are available. So we could look at Euromonitor, we could look at ones that look at the sort of the sector rather than just the specific business. Just bear in mind, I mean, your class is fairly small, but actually what you want to do with these assignments is get the markers' interest, show them something that's actually a little bit interesting about something that's going on, and it's sort of exploring it with that in mind. So we're looking at the finances, but actually we're looking at the finances bearing in mind something's happening. So that could be quite a good start. So we're looking at what's going on. We're looking at a wider market analysis. So where do they fit compared to their competitors? And have you got, yeah, just trying to find really good evidence sources for that. So it could even be industry press as well. You could, in this bit, if you wanted to, create a pestle. You don't have to. If you're going to use the pestle to look at the external operating environments, bear in mind this assignment is a finance assignment. So all I'm interested in is, like, how does this impact their financial position? So for each part of pestle, if you're going to do it, interpret it as in what this means in terms of the finances is X. Also, if you're going to use a pestle, please don't just put the generic stuff, because I'm fed up with reading pestles that have just got Brexit in, they've got COVID in, but there's no real substance, there's no connection to the assignment. The way a pestle works best is sort of quite short and sweet, but every statement has a really good source, so you get lots of marks there, and every part of it is about how it adds to the assignment and the understanding. So if you think it would be useful, the thing I'm conscious of is they're quite time consuming to do well, so don't just do it thinking you're going to get a couple of extra marks. Do it, if you do it really well. So the next section then I'd look at still about the organisation, so we're focusing on that first. Consider where they're going, so their direction and their funding. So with their direction, what I mean is, what are their objectives? So we may find that from their annual reports. We might find it from their company information. I'd hope we do, actually. If not, is there anywhere else that we can find out what they're up to? Are there any sort of press reports about what they're doing? So we get a bit of a steer really on where they're going. And then looking at how are they funded at the moment. So this will tie into the financial performance and the financial statements. So we could look, I think it's probably going to be the balance sheets there that we're looking at in terms of where they've got their capital from. So what are they, yeah, how are they funded at the moment? Is it borrowing? Is it equity? What is the, yeah, so trying to understand a little bit about the basis on which they've been built and the main sources of finance that they used, because that again ties into this learning outcome one, which includes appropriate sources of finance. So we're not making recommendations, we're just understanding the basis on which they're able to do their activities. The next part in this section, short and sweet, the value of regulation, I've called it, but this is just basically how are their how are their finances governed. So the corporate governance in their financial statements, what they adhere to. So are there any particular accounting standards that they adhere to? Not a huge amount here, just cover it off because it is part of the learning outcome. So it just shows, and really the role of adhering to certain standards, which really gives a level of consistency. It allows to benchmark against other organisations, and it shows a certain adherence to a conduct and a code of practice. So that's the value of it, but we want it to be specific to your organisation. Really good marks. What I'm keen you do, just be as specific to your organisation as possible. So no generic, not, none of this sort of descriptive about what this is or what that is. Specific to your organisation, this is how this relates, this is what it means, and actually these are the limitations or these are the benefits of it. So we're getting into application straight away, which naturally demonstrates knowledge, and then we're moving up to critical analysis to get the top marks. Because in the second year, you've got 7 out of your final 8 modules, the average grade can be your total your module, your degree classification, or it's 3 of the top out of your final 4. So this could contribute to your final degree classification. So we've looked at the organisation, about the organisation, we've looked at what's going on in it, we've found some really good sources, where their direction is, how are they funded and how are they regulated. So that's covered the first learning outcome in about 700 words. The second one, we're going to look at their financial performance, and this is where we're examining their financial statements. So this is learning outcome 3, distinguishing key financial data and accounting systems. So from the assessment, it said about evaluating and comparing the different types of financial statements and then looking at appropriate accounting concepts and frameworks used in producing them. So I've only put 500 words here. I've made this section a little bit shorter, so we've got a bit more for the final one, the stakeholders. But if you want to put more in it, that's absolutely fine. But I think we could do this quite concisely. So we started off by looking at the role of financial statements for your organisation. So this is really understanding how they work together, which one's historic, which one's looking at the current situation, what's looking ahead. So how they fit together to give a really nice picture of what's going on. Also discuss the relevant accounting concepts and frameworks that the organisation's using. So tailor it to your organisation. So have a look in the narrative on their financial statements, because that will include information there as to what they're adhering to. And then in this one, we're interpreting the 3 financial statements, the profit and loss or the income statement. We're looking at what the balance sheet tells us, and we're also looking at the cash flow statement. So we're going to have 3 sort of subsections there. We're looking at what it tells us about their performance, but also what it doesn't tell us as well. So we're ideally going to be quite critical here rather than just narrative. I also think on this one, have a little bit about other points, relevant points from their financial statements. And what I mean by that, their financial statements, very little of it tends to be numbers. A lot of it is it's very wordy. So what I'd like you to do is be really critical of their financial statements, because the numbers may say one thing, but how do they marry with the words and the narrative that they're using? Is there anything particularly interesting that you found about it, or anything that causes concern? Flag that up in this area. So we're really here looking at their financial performance, analysing the financial statements, understanding how they fit together and the accounting concepts they use, and just keeping our eye out. Is there anything particularly suspicious or particularly, a really good opportunity that potential investors might be interested in? So we've now done 2/3 of the assignment and we're looking at the final learning outcome. And I'd call this your stakeholder analysis. And I've taken some narrative, I've put 800 words for this, so it's slightly balanced a little bit higher than the others. And I've looked here at including some wording from the assessment brief. So this gives examples of different types of stakeholders, and it really talks about the benefits of investing in stakeholders, in particular in investors, and the sort of benefits this has. So a good starting point might be to look at who are their stakeholders. Now, I was interested to hear last time that you haven't done anything on stakeholders before, so therefore I've included in week one, it's a sheet from CMI, and it's like a series of how you do stakeholder analysis, so it's quite a comprehensive guide. So it's on week one, it's I think it's 243, it's called the fact sheet, and the source is a CMI, so you'd find it on Management Direct. So when you're having a look at this, or 234, sorry, rather than 243, okay, I've just captured a couple of parts of it and put it in this assessment breakdown and ideas document for you. So one way, when we're looking at stakeholders, is we look at who are sort of primary stakeholders, so they've got the biggest investment, the biggest stake in the business. So these are like really invested, so your employees, your customers, your suppliers, and your shareholders, and the business is in the centre, so they are the primary stakeholders. Then around those you've got external stakeholders, who are the secondary stakeholders. So in these example, we've got the competitors, our consumer groups that may lobby against what we do or be very for it, but they've got a vested interest, but they're not directly connected in the business. The media will be interested in what you're doing as well, and then the government. So that's one way of classifying our stakeholders, this idea of primary and secondary. So you might choose that. In addition, the stakeholder power interest matrix, this is really helpful when it comes to prioritising stakeholder communications. So we're looking at who fits in each group here. So who has a high interest and high power, who has a high interest and low power. But I don't want you explaining what these are. I want you applying them and talking about, actually, with this one, the challenge is, so critical analysis, it's never, it changes over time. So any stakeholder mapping that we do, we need to be very mindful that it's an evolving process, so we should keep on doing it. So you've got a bit there to look at, and I think you really need to sort of immerse yourself into that fact sheet, but also look at different sources. So you can get a variety of academic sources here for the stakeholder analysis to support these models, because you'll find them quite easily on Bibliu in different books, and that'll give you a chance to get more really good sources. So what we're interested in stakeholders, we want to know what is their stake in the business, what's their interest, and we want to classify them, because then that's really useful for communicating with them. And what we really want to do is understand where they're coming from. So what financial information are they interested in? Never mind what they're interested in, what results are they looking for as well? Okay. So that shouldn't be there. Sorry, let's examine the finance source. So get rid of that. So the next bit we've got, I do an audit of what communications are taking place. So we're looking here on financial communication. So it's not just communications in general. So they will tend to have organisations that are floated on the stock exchange. They tend to have an investor website, have a really good look at what's available there. So bigger organisations, the likes of JLR, will have quarterly reports, they'll have presentations. They're really quite visual in terms of how they're presenting information. So I want you not just to make assumptions, because on some of the assessments we looked at, they were sort of very generic. They send emails, they do this, that and the other. No. We want to look at, actually critically evaluate what are the communications they're doing. So what's the role of it? What's the frequency of it? Now, you'll have the public-facing communications that we can get access to as potential investors. So they'll pretend to be on the investment website. But of course, the internal communications, we're not part of, so we're not actually going to get access to what their financial, what they might be communicating there. So we may have to do some potential speculation on that in terms of internally, what are they going to use to communicate with employees, for example, how might they do that? So with each of these, when you're looking at the types and the methods of communication, I'm really keen that you also critically evaluate it, so that looking at the limitations and the benefits. Now, underpinning all this, we need some theory. So, in terms of communication theory, where you want to look here is there's three different communication models that you can look at. There's the linear model, which is where you've got a message, you encode it, you then send it out. So that's your Shannon and Weaver that you may have heard of. You've got your interactional. So this is where you've got other people almost communicating on the behalf of others. So this would be where you've got your vloggers or where you've got your influencers. But actually, there still might be a role in this. If you're looking at a younger investor base, you might be keen to try and get spoken about, really. So sort of almost like from a PR point of view, because other people's voice may have more credibility than yours if it's the right people. And they don't have to be industry experts. They can actually be people just with a following and a reputation. And then transactional, that might be sufficient for investors. It might, so I'd have a look at these. But again, don't be descriptive on them. If you're going to look at them, maybe look at how they fit with the communications that you've already seen. So what your organisation's doing, how does that fit a particular model? And then you could apply it. And I think with this, what we want to do, 2,000 words is not very many. So we need to put as many pictures in there as we can, sort of using smart art. So what you might do is create an image there of the communication process that they use. You might say it's Shannon and Weaver, in terms of a linear communication model, which is how they push out communications to shareholders. And then you can talk about, is that the most appropriate way? Should it be more of an engagement process where it's two-way, or actually is that fit for purpose? So what we're doing here is we're looking at what they're doing, but we're underpinning it, and we're understanding it even more by looking at the models that they're using to do it. And then we can also look at the critical analysis of those models for more ideas as to what the limitations are. So really here we've covered everything. We've started off by looking at the organisation as a whole. We've looked at what's going on, wider environment, what's going on internally, where are they going and how are they funded. We've also looked at how are they regulated. We've then gone on to look at their financial performance. We've really looked at their financial statements here and the frameworks that the financial statements are constructed under. And then we've moved on to the stakeholders. So we've looked at who they are, we've looked at how we can analyse them, we've looked at what communications are taking place and how they relate to our different stakeholders and how they relate to different communication theory. So we need to wrap this up in some way, and I wouldn't use a massive amount of your words to do this, but I just, in terms of concluding, based on your level of insight that you should now have through this thorough exploration, I'd consider what you'd suggest to them going forward. Are they missing any opportunities? Is there anything where you feel they've been particularly strong and they're not communicating that? I'd also consider the fact they're in the Tech Mark 100, so these are meant to be really sort of cutting edge organisations. Does their communication reflect that in terms of their financial information, or are there any recommendations you've got there? So hopefully this has been quite helpful in terms of considering how you're going to go about this first assignment and how you're going to start gathering your evidence to prepare for it. Okay, see you shortly.